Hi and welcome to the Z370 Battle of the Cheap. I've been overclocking for about 10 years, and during this time period I usually or mostly used extreme motherboards and motherboards that come out of the high-class price sector. Now with the launch of Z370 that's just a few weeks ago, I asked myself how good are boards that are focused on the lower price class and the entrance for overclocking. With the current Intel politics, you can basically just overclock with the C and X chipsets depending on which platform you want to use. And as I said before, in today's video, we are focusing on Z370, which is the chipset that's necessary for Coffee Lake. Basically, I took the 4 cheapest motherboards of each vendor, so ASRock, Asus, MSI and Gigabyte from our stock, and checked how good are the cheapest motherboards of each vendor. The cheapest board in our today's test is the MSI Z370A Pro. The board is available here in Germany for about 105 euro, and if you compare this board to like a high-end motherboard, the first thing you will probably notice that you're lacking all of the visual features. So you don't have any covers here, you only have minimal PCH cooling. And also one thing that I personally noticed first is the PCB. The PCB looks kind of brownish, so it doesn't look that much high quality. On the other hand, the VRM coolers actually look very nice and looks like they have pretty good surface area for a board in this price category. What I also like about the VRM heatsinks on this board is the fact that the VRM heatsinks are basically screwed to the motherboard. They're fixed with screws, and that's a very good aspect because with more mounting pressure and a very thin thermal pad, you can achieve better MOSFET temperatures. In today's video, we are not going to compare the boards on the theoretical specs of the MOSFETs because it doesn't really make that much sense, because eventually every MOSFET or VRM design is still limited by the ability of the coolers. So if you have a better VRM cooling, you can draw much more power than with no VRM cooler or a bad VRM cooler. So essentially, we will just do a test and see how high we can overclock the CPUs on each board. The second board in the test is the ASRock Z370 Pro 4. It's only 4 euros more expensive than the MSI board. It's still fairly cheap at around 110 euro. Again, if you compare this board to a high-end board, you will immediately notice that it's lacking most of the visual features like a massive VRM cooler like covers here. However, compared to the MSI board, the PCB itself looks a little bit more high quality. It has a nice black look and some silk screen stuff here. The VRM cooler itself looks a little bit smaller, doesn't have that much surface area, so we will see how this will affect the overclocking capabilities of this board. The third board in today's test is the Gigabyte C370 HD3, and that's also my personal favorite when it comes to the looks. The board itself looks very nice. I just like the black and gray color scheme. The PCB looks good. I also like the brushed aluminum style of the PCH heatsink. The heatsink design of the MOSFETs also looks pretty good. The surface area should be decent as well on this motherboard. What I don't like that much on this board is the way the heatsinks are mounted. They're just basically fixed with some pins that are going through the PCB of the mainboard, not even fixed with some springs. So I think if we would screw this directly with screws and proper mounting pressure, we could have a little bit better temperatures under load. The board itself costs 120 euros here in Germany, so it's still fairly okay. The fourth and last board in today's test is the Asus Prime Z370P motherboard. It comes at 140 euro, which is already a bit more expensive than the other boards, especially comparing it to the MSI and the ASRock board. The PCB itself looks quite alright, especially with the white silk screen stuff on top. I'm not really a fan of the MOSFET and the PCH heatsink color, but that's just my personal opinion. Surface-wise, the MOSFET heatsink looks good. It's also sitting fairly tight on with some springs, and also the thermal pad is quite thin, so it's not acting as a heat barrier, should be quite okay for cooling. What I found really interesting is the fact that most of those boards are advertised with very high memory speeds. So I asked myself, are all those boards really capable of running such high memory speeds? Especially using high density memory sticks, because it doesn't really make much sense in my eyes to run like 2x4 gigabyte sticks on those motherboards these days. For gaming, I would recommend at least 16 gigabytes, so 2x8. Of course, you could run 4x4 in some cases. That's actually better than running 2x8 on some boards. It really depends on the compatibility. So I just picked some memory kits from stock, and I basically just tested if the boards are capable of running those memory kits. The first kit is the Ballistic Sports LT. It's only 2400 MHz rated, so of course this memory kit has to run on every single board, otherwise the boards would have a serious problem. Second kit is a 3000 Course Vengeance LPX kit, and next kit in the test was the G-Skill Trident Z. It's rated at 3200 C16, followed by the Trident Z RGB 3600 C17, followed by Trident Z RGB 3866 C18, followed again by Trident Z RGB 4000 C18, and from this point on I really expected none of the boards could run it. And the last kit is the Team Group Extreme 8-Pack Edition. It's actually rated at 4133 C18, and I also used this to test 4000 and 4200 MHz. So let's take a look at the results of the ASRock board, and honestly this was a massive surprise. Well, I tested from the bottom to the top, and from the point of 3600 or 3866 MHz I expected the boards not to run anymore. But the ASRock board just kept booting and whatever I set, and you can see that I was even capable of running 4200 C19 on 110 euro motherboard, and that was just much more than I ever expected from a board in this price category. The Asus motherboard could run up to 3866, which is still fairly good, followed by the MSI Z370A Pro, which is also capable of running 3866, and considering it's only 105 euro, that's actually a really good result. And even the Gigabyte C370 HD3 was also capable of running 3600, which in my eyes is more than enough. Personally, I wouldn't really recommend to run more than 3600 MHz on the memory. There's not really a huge benefit, but at this point, like going higher, like 3866, 4000 and above, you pay so much more for the memory kits, and the benefit in performance is not really much. So I would really recommend that instead of getting like a massively expensive memory kit, you would spend a little bit more money for a main board with higher quality. Load line calibration is always important when it comes to overclocking. So basically, when you're running load on your CPU, the core voltage will drop down a little bit. So it's really necessary that you have the load line calibration option in your BIOS that helps to compensate the voltage drop. And in this case, I was also surprised that all of the boards have actually quite good load line calibration features. Because few generations ago I saw a lot of boards that either had only enable and disable option or didn't even have any settings for load line calibration. So in this case for Z370 I'm positively surprised. For the load line calibration testing I was basically running 1.40 volt and 5 GHz on the CPU, then running some load on Cinebench R15 and checking what the voltage drop was like. So you can see on the ASRock Z370 Pro 4 on auto the voltage dropped down to 1.264, and in the BIOS we had 4 levels as option to set the load line calibration. On level 1 you would have 1.36 volt, which is more than enough, so that it's absolutely sufficient. On the Asus board on auto it dropped to 1.36, which is actually pretty much ideal. So on the Asus board it wouldn't really be necessary to touch the load line calibration feature. You could go to level 7 and reduce the voltage drop even a little bit more by having 1.376 volt. On the MSI board the voltage was the same for load and idle, so 1.40 volt, which equals to level 4 on this motherboard. You could increase it even more with level 1, 2 and 3, which is a massive overshoot. So level 1 would be almost 1.5 volt, which would be definitely way too much. So in this case I would recommend to use level 4 or level 5. On the Gigabyte board you have 3 options. You have standard, high and turbo. Auto results in 1.26 volt, which equals to standard. So that's also a quite massive drop, and I would recommend to set it to either high or turbo. As I said in the beginning, instead of doing some theoretical testing of the MOSFETs and comparing specs, we are doing a test where I set all the mainboards on an open test bench with basically no airflow, and this way you can compare the capability of the heatsink to dissipate heat and also the capability of the MOSFET to check what the power draw is like. So looking at this chart, you can see in Prime 95 I was able to draw 131 watt using the MSI 370A Pro. On the ASRock board I could draw 123 watts, on the Asus board 118 watt, and on the Gigabyte board 115 watt. Of course, if you would put a fan directly over your heatsink and you have a much better airflow, you would be able or capable of drawing a lot more power, like 20 or 30 watt more. So what do those figures like 131 watt mean in real clock figures? So looking at this chart, you can see that on the MSI board I was able to run 5.1 GHz at 1.36 volt. On the Asus board I could run 5G at 1.3 volt. On the ASRock board I could run 5G at 1.28 volt, and on the Gigabyte I could also run 5G at 1.272 volt. So all four boards can actually run 5 GHz on the CPU if your CPU is good enough, because, for example, on the ASRock board I could not increase more than 1.28 volt because it would result in a too high power consumption, and therefore the VRMs would eventually throttle and clock down. So if you want to run 5G on those boards, you need a CPU that has very low voltage for 5G. Unless you're using the MSI board, which could run 5.1. So the question was, are all the boards actually capable of running 5.1 if I'm putting a fan on top of the VRMs? And I can confirm that it's actually possible to run 5.1G on all of those four boards if you put a fan directly on the VRM, so the airflow is really good and keeps the VRM cold. In this case, you can increase the core voltage quite a lot more and still the CPU will stay stable at 1.36 volt. One last thing I noticed was that the cache frequency was not the same on all boards. So on the ASRock board, while all cores were on load, the cache frequency was 4.3 GHz, while on Asus and MSI it was 4G, and the Gigabyte board only had 3.7 GHz. I think the official spec would be 4G. I'm not 100% sure, but in this case ASRock would be a bit too high and Gigabyte would be a bit too low. Still, the cache frequency doesn't influence the performance that much, but it was nice to see that. Overall, I was really impressed, and I didn't expect that you can run especially such high memory frequencies on those cheap boards, and also that you can clock the boards on like 5 and 5.1 GHz was also quite impressive. Personally, if you would ask me what my recommendation would be for the cheapest 370 board, I would say definitely it's the MSI Z370A Pro, because this board is like 105 euro. You can clock the memory to 3866 MHz, and the CPU was even capable of running 5.1G. The ASRock board was also quite solid, especially considering the fact that I could run 4200 MHz on the memory. That was absolutely impressive. So if you're looking for a cheap board that can still run high memory frequencies, this would be my recommendation in this case. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you're looking for the cheapest Z370 board, I hope this helped you a little bit. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. See you soon.